Let's turn our attention back to the budget ahead of tomorrow night. Let's bring in the Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume. Thanks so much for your time. The government confirming an increase in the age where the single parenting payment cuts off. Do you welcome that change?
Well, we know that there are a lot of Australian families, not just single parents, but also dual income families that are really doing it tough right now and making some really difficult decisions about their own family budgets. We would expect that the Labor government will do the same with their budget on Tuesday night. And the way that they can do that is to bring down inflation by reining in their spending. Because quite frankly, even if you say you have a cost of living budget, unless you're tackling inflation, unless you're bringing inflation down, unless you're making tackling inflation your number one priority in your budget, well, simply that's making all Australians pay the price, because the longer inflation it stays high, that's a reduction in living standards. So if they really wanted to tackle the cost of living, they'd tackle inflation first and foremost.
On that specific payment though, that increase, it cuts off at the age of 8, when the youngest is at 8 for a single parent. Now it's going to go to the age of 14. Is that something you'd support?
Well, we'll look at the details tomorrow night, obviously. There's a number of payments that are being announced. We're hearing increases in JobSeeker as well as those single parent payments. And that's an increased expenditure, increased pressure on the budget. And we don't know whether it will, in fact, increase inflation. We heard Katie Gallagher, just in your interview a little bit earlier, saying that they're doing everything they can to make sure that they aren't making the RBA's job harder. But what they've really done there is wave the white flag. They've said that inflation isn't our responsibility, it's the RBA's responsibility. Now, we don't want to make Philip Lowe's job harder, but they can make Philip Lowe's job easier. And it's really up to the government, it's their responsibility, this is part of governing, to make sure that your fiscal policy is working in the same direction as your monetary policy. Otherwise, it's like having one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. Unless they're tackling inflation as a standalone policy priority, they're not doing their job.
The government's and the Finance Minister announced also today a $17.8 billion package of savings and reprioritisation of spending. Is that not enough?
Savings, that's an interesting word that they've used there, because are they in fact savings or are they simply offsets for expenditure? This government is rolling around in revenue. We've seen increased commodity prices skyrocketing. We've seen bracket creep allowing for dramatically increased income tax revenues. And only around 60% of that is going to go back to the budget bottom line. The rest of it is being spent. That's $17.8 billion. They've already said that 7.8 of that is simply reprioritisation, one type of submarine for another type of submarine. The other $10 billion, well, what is that? Is that simply reprioritisation of an amount of money that was already going to be spent into something else that's a Labor priority? That's not a saving, that's an offset. So we're going to be forensically going through exactly what it is that Labor are calling a saving and finding out whether it's simply a rebadge of something that already existed.
Do you think with the JobSeeker payment, we touched on the single parent payment, but with JobSeeker to be increased by up to $40 a fortnight, it's not a huge amount, but for people, many of them living in poverty, it's hard to begrudge them, isn't it?
Well, families are really doing it tough. We understand that, and they are vulnerable that we want to see looked after. But at the same time, if you don't tackle inflation, that increase in JobSeeker is simply going to be eroded away. And that's why this must be the policy priority of this government. It must be to not just tackle inflation, to reduce it, to bring it down. And the only way you can do that is to rein in those natural Labor tendencies for a high-spending, high-taxing budget.
A surplus is going to be delivered. That's something that a government hasn't been able to do for quite a long period of time. Do you concede that for the Labor government will be a symbolic moment for them to say, well, you've said we can't manage the budget, here's a surplus?
No, I think Angus Taylor said it correctly, that a drover's dog could deliver a surplus in these environments. They're built on the strong economic conditions that were left to them by the coalition government just a year ago. Low unemployment, a growing economy, a budget that was coming back into balance, an additional $115 billion off the debt. They've built on that. That's terrific. But the real test is going to be, can you maintain a surplus? Can you deliver a surplus, not just in this financial year, but in future financial years? Because you've got to do that, you've got to rein in your spending. And to rein in your spending, that goes against every instinct that sits with Labor. And that's why we're going to see inflation higher for longer if they can't rein in that spending.
The petroleum resource rent tax increase is something that's been welcomed, in fact, by the industry. I spoke to Samantha McCulloch from APIA, who represents the gas and oil industry. She said this gets the balance right.
Well,
it's hard for the coalition to disagree with it when the industry is supporting it.
Well, obviously the PRRT was something that was considered by the Callaghan Review, started under the coalition. But of course that was before a time where there was a price cap put on gas. It was before a time where there was a safeguard mechanism put in place as well. This comes on top of that. Now, I'm not entirely sure how many hits this industry can sustain before investment just dries up. And we know the only way to sustainably get energy prices down is if you bring new investment into the system. Adding another tax is simply another deterrent to new investors. So
you're opposed to that increase?
Well, we'll look at the PRRT in its full as part of the budget, the whole budget package. But I do think it's worthwhile considering what the implications are going to be for new investors into the gas supply.
Jane Hume, Shadow Finance Minister, thanks. We'll talk to you soon. A big week.
Thanks, Kieran.